I think the law and policy aspect is really crucial. I've been amazed within conservative world or pro-life world even at the number of people who choose to come to Washington, D.C. to make this their place for their career, but then insist on pointing at things like our proposal to make birth free and say, nah, it's never going to work. It's never going to change anything. We shouldn't do it. In other words, they adopt this mode that says, well, law and policy really doesn't change culture. And I look around and I say, then why did you move to Washington, right? Like, why did you move to your state capital? Why are you helping politicians if you think law and policy doesn't change culture? Clearly you do.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny Burtka and Marlo Slayback.
Today we're joined by Tom Shakely, who's the Chief Engagement Officer of Americans United for Life, a global human rights leader advancing the human right to life and culture, law, and policy. He's also a research fellow at Discovery Institute's Center on Human Exceptionalism, which strives to awaken the conscience on the relationship between human rights and responsibilities. Tom holds a BA in political science from the Pennsylvania State University, MS in bioethics from the University of Mary, and MA in human rights from the Catholic University of America. And he lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife and son. It's great to have you on today, Tom.
It's such a pleasure to be with you both.
Before we begin our discussion, I'd like to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission is educating for liberty. If you'd like to join us in fulfilling this mission, please be sure to rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. So, Tom, starting off, could you just give us an overview of what Americans United for Life is doing, the different topics that you're interested in, and how you personally became involved and interested? You have an interesting background in everything from like bioethics to, like human rights and things like that. So it seems like a really good kind of like groundwork for this sort of organization. But how did these different pieces come together for you?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, AUL, Americans United for Life, was founded a long time ago relative to a lot of our friends and partners in the movement. We were founded in 1971 by a group of really far-sighted and, we think, prophetic leaders from across the spectrum of faith backgrounds, from across the political spectrum. It can be hard for some folks to believe, given the work we do. But so much has changed in the past 50 plus years since our founding and our culture. A lot of it challenging change on human rights, broadly speaking, our ability to recognize the image of God in one another. AUL is not a Christian organization, but I'm a Catholic, and so for me, as it's inseparable. The work that I do, what led me to be pro-life, was community, it was family, it was going through so many of the right to life issues at home. Growing up. Coming to realize at a certain point that my mother made a heroic decision to choose life for me. My father wasn't interested in being involved, wasn't interested in being a father. And so I got to grow up, thanks be to God, in a multi-generational home with my mother, some uncles, my grandparents outside of Philadelphia. And there was so much fruit in that. And one of the aspects of that was getting to live with my grandfather, who later, as I was growing up, started experiencing Alzheimer's. And we got to care for him in the home for many years, right up until the end, when he required, really 24/7 care in terms of a feeding tube, nutrition, and hydration. And so those are two of kind of the personal cornerstones for me for being pro-life, was realizing how gifted I was to have a mother, to happen to be conceived in a family that just as a default said yes to life, and realizing, especially as I've grown older, how many others just don't have that. And realizing that while the personal decisions to choose life are great, the fact that the law has adopted such indifference to those questions, to the question of whether it's good for America to have more Americans in it, of whether it's good for law and policy to encourage life, to make it a default, even amidst cultural breakdown elsewhere. And then realizing, in terms of the experiences in caring for my grandfather, across the spectrum of issues, things like patients' rights, broadly speaking, but also specifically true care at the end of life, and how many aren't necessarily even denied that, but how many just experience the same kind of ingrained indifference at that point in life, whether it's Alzheimer's or dementia or some other chronic condition or terminal condition, and realizing that we need to do more in our culture, in our law, in our policy. And so with all that as a personal background, when I discovered Americans United for Life, I thought, this makes sense that this organization exists. Thank God for AUL, and realizing that we need to continue to build on it. While the culture's changed, while it's not as easy to find the kind of diversity in background for board members, for supporters, for public recipients of our information, for lawmakers, the kind of political diversity that we had at the very beginning, there's a sort of a renewed fervency today that I think certainly 20 years ago, around the time of the partial birth abortion ban fight that was successful, or 30 or more years ago, around the time of Planned Parenthood v. Casey, when the pro-life movement was at a different point in many respects. I think, today it is like night and day from those times. There's a renewed vigor, not just because Roe has finally been reversed, not just because we live in a post-Dobbs America, but because I think, at least within the movement, there's a renewed sense that we need to embrace political solutions to cultural problems as much as we're embracing cultural solutions to the political problems.
Tom, that's a powerful personal testimony of experiencing not just obviously the courageous choice that your mother made, but also that holistic, familial environment, really from birth to death, that you've been able to be a part of. And I'm sure that played a large role in your interest not only in the abortion issue, but also in terms of supporting families after birth. So I'm wondering if you could share a bit more. You guys made waves with a proposal recently to make birth free. And I'm wondering if you could, outline your vision there, what the costs of that would be, but also what the positive benefit would be, and what your experience has been talking with conservatives who might be hesitant to, get the government involved paying for things, beyond basic, services.
Roads and bridges and so forth. Right. No, I know. Thank you, Johnny. I think, the proposal that AUL put out right around the March for Life in 2023, Make Birth Free. Gosh, this is a provocative title, right? We took it from actually a journalist, Elizabeth Bruenig. We borrowed the concept from her. She wrote a piece in The Atlantic the summer prior, so just really a few weeks after Roe v. Wade was reversed. I think her piece appeared in The Atlantic in July of 2022. And it was called Make Birth Free. And she laid out essentially her reasons for why the pro-life movement should lean into this kind of policy. And at the time, all of us at Americans United for Life, we saw this piece, we circulated it through the team, we shared it with close stakeholders, and we really thought on it. Our leadership started to speak about it publicly and incorporate the concept as something we should talk about pretty much right away. We had testimony in front of the U.S. House that summer, and we mentioned that as something that we should be considering, whether you're Republican or pro-life or Democratic or whatever. But it came into kind of full birth, so to speak, in the form of this white paper, this policy paper that we put out in January. It took us a few months, and we thought, what would be the best way to implement that? Because AUL has been doing law and policy work for decades. We've advised state lawmakers, but we've also fought and won at the federal level. AUL was closely involved with the fight for the Hyde Amendment in the 1980s as that was winding its way through both Congress and then to some degree the courts. And we realized that good policy like this can really, really change the culture. It can create a new Overton window for how we think about what's normal in a way where, as conservatives, right, we're so often feeling like we're reactive. We're having to react to the other side. And we thought making birth free is a way that actually we can change that dynamic. So just a brief bit of history, the Affordable Care Act, right, Obamacare. One of the things that it did is that it exempted from copays, from deductibles in health insurance plans, things like sterilization, forms of contraception. And so, in fact, what it did was it enshrined a kind of antinatalism in the heart of our healthcare system. there have been much bigger problems with the Affordable Care Act from conscience perspective and from other perspectives that we can look to in the culture. We know the Supreme Court fights about it. We know the dramas to try to repeal and replace Obamacare that have not panned out. So we know all that, but I think that antinatalism aspect of it is a lesser known aspect of the Affordable Care Act. And we looked around on the Hill and we said, well, there are not the votes to repeal and replace the Affordable Care Act. There weren't a few years ago. There aren't today. Maybe there will be in the future. But we have to be prudent and we have to act with the political conditions that we have today. And so why not reverse the dynamic of antinatalism and, as a pro-life organization, start to speak for the imperative of pronatalism? At a time of collapsing birth rates, sure, from a civilizational standpoint, but really from a concrete familial standpoint, a pro-life imperative to say, why is it that we're exempting being sterilized from a copay or deductible, but we continue to be indifferent to the massive and growing costs of things like pregnancy and childbirth in particular as an act? And so, whether it would be in the form of a kind of a Medicare for pregnancy, or whether it would be in the form of simply copying that language from the ACA and saying, so long as we're going to subsidize sterilization, we're also going to subsidize pregnancy and childbirth. We're going to make sure that when mother and father go for those OB appointments early in pregnancy, they're not getting nickel and dimed, having to pay $30 for each visit. And that when they go to the hospital, they're not going to, in the heat of the moment, choose the wrong specialist and end up with a $15,000, $20,000 bill, or frankly, even a $5,000 bill for care that is natural, that's vital. Pregnancy, childbirth is the number one reason for hospitalization in the United States. But unlike every other reason for hospitalization, it's natural. It's a good thing, when you end up there, pregnant, expecting as parents. And then, if you want to give birth in a hospital, to do that. And so the idea that copays and deductibles, which typically exist for the purpose of disincentivizing overutilization of care, right? Think of like the hypochondriac who wants to go in every week to the doctor just to get checked to make sure things are fine. It's good to make that kind of person pay $30 a visit because it can kind of disincentivize maybe needless visits. But OB appointments are necessary for everyone throughout the pregnancy. And childbirth, for those who choose a hospital, that's a necessary thing. There's no way to overutilize your hospital visit when it comes time to deliver the baby, right? And so we thought of all these things and said, it's time to change this dynamic. It's time to say that pronatalism is a pro-life priority and that we can no longer be indifferent to these costs, whether we think these costs are the limiting factor for people thinking about when to start a family or how many kids to have, or whether we just recognize that they are a reality and whether they're the driving reason for people making familial decisions, family formation, child growth, etc. They're a factor, and the pro-life movement can't continue to be indifferent to them, especially after Roe has been reversed.
Real quick, and I'll let Marlo jump in there. I'm curious, have you concretely calculated the average cost, from appointment, initial appointments all the way through birth for an average mother?
Yeah, it varies, of course, but the rough figure that I could throw out is somewhere between $3,000 and $5,000 would be a good average, depending on the state, depending on condition, pre-existing conditions, etc. So yeah, people are paying.
I think you were on. So my friend Jessica Kramer, who's actually a Collegiate Network fellow, I believe you spoke with her recently. I saw on her podcast, and I was speaking with her a few weeks earlier for her show as well about home birth. And so I had my first through home birth, and what was really interesting there was my home birth midwife actually did a stratification of your family's ability to pay. She didn't want to make it a prohibitive cost, so that if someone from a lower class background wanted to seek out home birth because they had, a low risk pregnancy, there was no need for them to go into the hospital. There's a different number of different reasons why a woman would want to seek out that sort of care. So she actually offered 3 tiers of payment scheduling. So if you were, someone who was, maybe in a lower class, didn't have to pay the same price that someone in the middle or upper class would have to. I thought that was this is someone who's in a position that's extremely risky. Like, it's a really risky business. You're still, just like a restaurant would, receiving reviews online. So you're like, I would be terrified if I was her. I mean, she's
Yeah.
so talented though. So like, she's a saint that she's been doing this for 20 years, but that was really, I was kind of explaining to Jessica how I was like really gratified to see that, because, I think there's been a growing movement, especially after COVID, of women seeking out alternative birth options that aren't just the usual hospital birth setting. And I get it. Like, the hospital is a very sterile place. We associate it with unfortunate emergencies, right? Rather than birth. And a lot of the literature I was reading at the time from midwives like Ina May Gaskin was like, birth doesn't have to be a medical event. It's natural. Women are designed to have children, and it doesn't always have to be in this this setting of the hospital. So I spoke with Jessica a little bit about it, just for any moms who are considering midwifery and home birth. And we paid out of pocket. We didn't use insurance at all on our home birth. And so it still ended up being, comparable to what we would have paid anyways. So just getting that out there for any, moms or, women who are interested in having children soon, that's an option in many cases. And something else that I wanted to ask you about was, I know Brad Wilcox, he's coming out with a book soon, about marriage specifically, but I think him and Institute for Family Studies have come out with some really interesting research lately that I encourage everyone to look at. But one of I forget if this was them or some other organization, but a lot of women are, saying that if they could, they would have had 1.75 or whatever more children than they actually had.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in hearing about what you think the factors are. Perhaps this is at the policy or maybe the cultural that's impacting women's, desires to perhaps have fewer children, because obviously the birth rate is quite low. And this is kind of a universal thing right now. I've heard people say, well, it's cultural, right? Like, women don't want to be having children right now for whatever reason. I'm honestly, as someone who would like to see more policies implemented that would make it more feasible for families to have children if they want to, and more children for that. I also think a lot of it is simply cultural. People don't want to be having kids. So what are your thoughts and observations from what you've seen?
Wow, I mean, so much great stuff there, Marla. I think one thing I'll start off, actually, this is a pet project I hope ISI takes up, because you guys know the power of the true, the good, the beautiful. Hospitals, you mentioned, they're not just sterile, they're ugly. They're ugly, and it's crazy to me that, whether you're going there to give birth or going there, because you're ready to die, that you would want to do either of those things in these places. And so, you look back at architecture from a century ago, and I don't know, maybe Roger Scruton or somebody's written about this, but like, please lead the charge. We need beautiful hospitals again, whether you're there or whether you're giving home to, a home birth or something. And I think on the home birth side too, our Make Birth Free proposal, it's not a one size fits all. We do include models and concepts in the policy paper, and we're working with some lawmakers to figure out what legislation might look like at the congressional level, so that it's not just necessarily for folks with private insurance. It could also incentivize, and you could do this. The more aggressive you get with the approach, the more bipartisan it gets, probably. You could have funding reimbursements for things like birthing centers in your neighborhood, doulas, midwives. My wife and I used a doula. It was transformative for our experience. We were in the hospital in Virginia, but the doula was so key. And so to kind of mix and match those kind of services, we think we should be supporting this as kind of an all of the above policy solution. Although the title is provocative, because, we immediately get folks, I love Milton Friedman, I love Thomas Sowell, et cetera. We immediately get some good-natured folks who want to come in, and the most important comment they have is nothing is free, right? And it's like, yeah, we get it. It's making birth free at the point of delivery to the mother and father. But in any event, we provision public goods all the time when we think they're in the common good. And so I think, on all these matters, it's about kind of reorienting our gaze to one another. And so when it comes to why are people, either like Brad Wilcox's literature that he points out, that social phenomena that mothers and fathers, I think too, but especially mothers, they always say they wish they had one more kid than they do, right? And I think that's a natural thing, right? As a Christian, I look around and it's like I would like always more friends, more community, more goodness, right? There's not enough goodness that we can get that we really say like that's enough. The things that we say that we have enough of are the things that actually can be vices, like maybe I've had enough chocolate for today or whatever the thing is, right? Because more than that actually is bad. But there's no such thing as too many kids. Nobody looks around and says, gosh, we have 9, but I really wish we stopped at 8. You know, and so that social phenomenon I think is a reality for mothers that have children. Once you have your first, I think you're going to experience that. If you never get to that point of having your first child, I think it's a lot easier. Or if you're in a social milieu where you're surrounded by friends, colleagues, etc., where none of them have a child, or maybe they have one as kind of a fashion accessory, and that's it. We got he got the vasectomy after that or something. Then it's a lot easier to kind of look at it and look at not just your child, but also human relations through the lens of burden rather than gift. That everybody's sort of like putting themselves on me. My husband wanted me to do this thing on Saturday, and he knows that's my day off. And my professional colleague asked me to go to the baseball game with. I don't even like it's like, and you just come to think in that mode. And if you think in that mode, then of course everything sort of seems like a hassle. Why have more? Why start at all? And then badmouth that kind of culture to others. So I think there's a big cultural lens. But taking off my psychologist hat for a second, I think the law and policy aspect is really crucial. I've been amazed within conservative world or pro-life world even at the number of people who choose to come to Washington, D.C. to make this the place for their career, but then insist on pointing at things like our proposal to make birth free and say, nah, it's never going to work. It's never going to change anything. We shouldn't do it. In other words, they adopt this mode that says, well, law and policy really doesn't change culture. And I look around and I say, then why did you move to Washington, right? Like, why did you move to your state capital? Why are you helping politicians if you think law and policy doesn't change culture? Clearly you do. And so I think that's a part of the conservative movement. I think we need to do a little bit of surgery on, to do a little bit of healing on, because I think, I know I can certainly speak for myself. There are certain ways that I've been so snake bit by just what I've grown up with in politics over the past 20 plus years of my adult political life, of seeing how things play out and seeing the kind of successes and the failures or the reverses that happen. Roe v. Wade's overturn was a tremendous success, sort of unanticipated in so many ways. But it did finally happen, and there are reverses too. But we can't lose hope about the importance of law and policy to change those cultural defaults. Think about what Hungary's done as one example, and you can debate whether the birth rate has actually increased or not, whatever. That just the policy program to say that if a mother, a working mother, has 4 children or more, that she's exempt from income tax for the rest of her life on her income. Gosh, that makes a lot of sense. Makes sense to me because it incentivizes mothers to stay in the workforce. So it satisfies the desire for equal outcomes or equitable outcomes that the left tends to have more of a focus on. And it satisfies the concerns of the right because it means that there's going to be more wealth for the family rather than wealth for the state to be frivolously spent. And it's not as if we have cost controls today that are effective for stewarding our national wealth or our priorities. And so when I look at something like making birth free or any policy change to incentivize stronger families, I say, isn't it about time that we did reverse the dynamic where we're so reactive and we said, let's have a program that adopts successful logic in existing law and policy and subsidizes pro-life families that want to have kids. The goal shouldn't be a sort of a legal neutrality that says, well, if you want to have a big family or if you want to have a family at all, that's a personal choice. And the state's going to make sure to pave those roads and make sure, most of the bridges don't collapse, but it's not going to help you very much in terms of the family formation other than a child tax credit, which, do whatever you want with. Put an addition on your home, gamble. If you want to invest in your child's future, fine, etc. No, this says that there's a new default. And I think that alone can do a lot to help encourage the sort of people whether you're young, you're in your early 20s, or you're having brunch with your friends, and you're caught between those worlds. Half of your friends think one way, half think the other way. Just the idea that America would have a particular point of view as a legal matter about what's good for the person and what's good for the family, that would be a tremendous conservative victory. And the final note I'll share on that is we've done this before. So I know, I've spoken to some conservative friends who did think, well, is it just government expansion? It's not actually. It's a return to our roots. We had in the 1920s, Dr. Alan Carlson, professor emeritus at Hillsdale, has written about this in his book, The American Way, and he wrote about it in a piece at the Institute for Family Studies called The Forgotten History of Making Birth Free. And he wrote about the Shepard-Towner Maternal and Infancy Act of the 1920s. This was passed overwhelmingly by a bipartisan Congress. It was signed by a Republican president, Harding, and it was in place 10 years. Unfortunately, it was sunset just months before the Great Depression. But the Shepard-Towner bill was the first universal benefit in American history, precursor to the New Deal, precursor to things like Social Security, because at the time there was a bipartisan consensus and a Republican president who understood that creating a universal benefit that wasn't means tested, where the government hired basically nurses and doctors to go out and train families and train mothers in everything from basic health to make sure that things that I never would have thought of, like gastrointestinal diseases that threaten the lives of children in the womb, things like that could be worked out naturally without needless medical intervention. But also that people were empowered to give home births or to give birth safely and to raise children safely. The government said that there was a priority there, and we've done it before, so we can do it again.
Tom, with that example from Hungary that you mentioned, a lot of people like to kind of quibble and say, oh, well, the birth rates haven't really increased that much, or you can't show any causation. But I think if you zoom out a bit, there are a lot of other statistics like the rates of marriage increasing, the rates of divorce going down. In light of the sort of the suite of pro-family policies, it at least sends the signal that if something's good, we should want to incentivize more of it. And I think that really does impact the culture in many ways, besides just maybe looking at one particular vertical and measuring things.
Right.
I'm curious you had mentioned, the tremendous victory, the overturn of Roe v. Wade, which, I share. I was always, perhaps cautiously optimistic that it would be overturned, but it sort of was shocking that that day actually came. I'm curious now, as we look to this, both at the state level and then at the national level, especially as so many presidential candidates are talking about their plans. How does the pro-life movement respond with what appears to be a significant backlash against pro-life legislation or attempts to restrict abortion access? I don't know. How would you message it, approach it, if you were advising a presidential candidate?
Well, when the fight over gay marriage was picking up steam, really when it hit its apex, and you're maybe thinking, where is he going with this? But, so some 30 states had held ballot initiatives, plebiscites, basically, to say, is gay marriage constitutional in the state or not? And even states like California said no, because they understood at the time what the nature of marriage was. But when that ballot referendum movement came to the District of Columbia, I believe the National Organization for Marriage, I think that it was the case that they had just gotten like the requisite number of signatures to get on the ballot, or they were close to it or something like that. It was a procedural thing. And the history of it's fascinating because the head of the DC Human Rights Commission stepped in, and apparently that office has some sort of legal prerogative in combination with the DC City Council, and they were able to squash that ballot initiative. And the quote at the time from the head of the DC Human Rights Commission was, "Human rights don't get put to a vote. That's why we're stopping this ballot initiative." And really, that was the end of the momentum of that of the pro-family ballot initiatives on that movement. Before you had Obergefell a few years later. And I've thought about that for a long time because it's sort of perfect. It's inverted in terms of what it views as the good, but it's a perfect encapsulation of a natural law reality, which is that human rights don't get put to a vote. That's correct. That's what we learned through the fight over slavery. That's what Lincoln taught us. That an indifference even to this thing is not conducive to the good. And so I think about, when we look at where we are today, or what I would advise a potential pro-life president, aspirational or otherwise, I think at a top line, let's have the courage to recognize that the head of the DC Human Rights Commission was correct. Human rights don't get put to a vote. And what that means is that our long-term goal, the strategic end of the pro-life movement, remains the same as it ever was, which is the equal protection for all human persons, the abolition of abortion, the abolition of things like assisted suicide, or other forms of anti-human acts across the spectrum of pro-life issues. And so when we recover that proper sense of what human rights are, that they're not just something that 51% of people voted on in a ballot initiative, they're not just something that Congress voted on, but they're actually an enduring reality. They're an objective reality embedded in our world. And we can choose to work against that reality. We can choose to fight it. We can choose to try to corrode it. We can choose to ignore it. But, if we want to do good law and policy, we should work with it because it's a part of our world. And so that's I think the overarching advice, that the strategic ends of the pro-life movement are the same as they ever were. We've got to take courage at this time, but simply maintaining that moral high ground, that if we don't put these things to a vote, what does it mean? Well, it means being steadfast in their advocacy, their defense. There are some procedural things I think, we at AUL and our latest addition of the team, Harris Schreier, can speak to in terms of states, for instance, that have currently the ability for outside groups to come in and pump tens of millions of dollars in to essentially buy a ballot referendum, as we had recently in Ohio, where they're going to vote on it this November. States like that should immediately move to say that either a referendum needs a legislative referral. In other words, your elected representatives who you elect to pass law and policy need to have some visibility on this, rather than just letting big money, dark money, outside groups buy their way onto the ballot and then spend tens of millions and more to message to buy an outcome. Instead, let this work through the democratic process. Let this work through the legislatures. So we're encouraging states that currently have that 51% threshold to say, you can increase it, but you can also do legislative referrals. Both of those are very consonant with the democratic process. They're a better form of democracy than direct democracy, so-called, which is really just money democracy. And so that's a practical thing. And I think on a longer-term level for the executive branch, AUL has a thing called the Lincoln Proposal. And we really wanted to adapt what Lincoln's crucial insight was in terms of, you think about the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln's often remembered for talking about the importance of public sentiment. Some people can read that as a kind of a mandate for being more cautious, which, you can do that. But you can also read it as a mandate for being bold and aggressive, because Lincoln didn't just say, follow public sentiment. He said you have to shape public sentiment. And he criticized Douglas specifically for Douglas's indifference to the evil of slavery. Lincoln was willing to moralize. He was willing to say that this is an injustice, this thing called slavery. This is an abomination. And Douglas's problem, in his view, was that he maintained a sort of an air of indifference toward it. And that air of indifference is precisely what would shape public sentiment to embrace slavery over time. That was Lincoln's view. And so Lincoln really saw the need to kind of paint in bold colors and not pale pastels, right? And he did that so successfully. Well, and we've got to continue to do that on abortion, recognizing that indifference to it at a congressional level, if we don't pass things like a pain-capable bill, or indifference to it at an executive level, if we don't adapt AUL's Lincoln Proposal, if you're a pro-life president, will lead the public to an embrace of it, regardless of the fact that Roe itself has been reversed, that it's been consigned to the ash heap of history. And so the Lincoln Proposal is all about setting a whole series of policy recommendations for a pro-life president to do all through executive branch agencies. Think about all the good that the FDA could do on something like abortion pills, abortion drugs. But there's so many other areas, and so that's an example where we need a pro-life president to recognize that there are things we can do in the meantime. But as the culture continues to churn on this issue, equal protection may very well eventually look like what we had after Brown v. Board of Education, where federal agents, the military, you name it, may need to go in to certain states to enforce equal protection in the same way that we enforced racial desegregation, in the same way we enforced the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution in the South. That's the long-term endpoint for to ensure equal protection for all human persons, because we can't assume every one of the states, the most pro-abortion states today, are going to be receptive to it. And so just talking about these things, largely hypotheticals for the time being, but just talking them through and getting ourselves prepared to recognize that there will come a point in time when we need to be willing to act toward these ends, toward the ends of justice, is so key. Because right now the pro-life movement, in the heat, the fog of its victory after Dobbs, can get discouraged. The media certainly wants it to. The left certainly wants it to. But we've been through these periods before. After Planned Parenthood v. Casey in 1992, the pro-life movement went through, almost a decade of kind of casting about tactically, strategically, until great folks like Hadley Arcus and others started recognizing, let's do something here with partial birth abortion, to awaken the conscience. You think this thing is so good, the Supreme Court's just reaffirmed it. What about partial birth? Killing the child when their body is well more than 2/3 out of the womb. Sort of an assassination of the baby. What do we think of that? And that passed Congress. It was upheld by the Supreme Court under the Roe regime. And that changed hearts and minds too at its time. And so that's an example where there are going to be some years of casting about we have to be prepared for. I think we're in that right now. I certainly hope the outcome in 2024 is a positive one from the pro-life perspective on the president's level and on down. But whatever the case, talking through all the things that we're going to need to do in the states, in Congress, and at the level of the executive is crucial, because if we don't talk it through, if we don't figure out what needs to be done, we're never going to get the opportunity even to do it.
So we are running out of time, but I definitely wanted to ask you about another looming pro-life issue, which is euthanasia. And I'm sure, if you're listening, you've probably seen some of the horrific accounts of what's happening in Canada regarding euthanasia. And unfortunately, I think it's probably a bleak reality of that spreading in the US as well. So given just the indifference to other pro-life issues, that's just, maybe I'm being pessimistic, but what would you say about that threat of, it's not only the end of life, so, the elderly, but also it could include people who are, I think in Canada, I've seen, the disabled, people who are poor, quote unquote undesirables, like just horrific indifference to the dignity of human life. What do you see for the future of the US and the approach to euthanasia as a, especially taking it under, what AUL is trying to achieve as, out of the kind of consistent pro-life ethic? How would you say that that's going to become, do you see it becoming an increasingly more prevalent threat?
It's amazing, Marlo. Our founders at AUL, Dennis Horan was an attorney in Chicago, and there were so many others, but Dennis was really the leader in the early years. They came together and it was in 1977, I think, they published a book called Death, Dying, and Euthanasia. Now, at the time, 1977, just really like one election cycle away from the Roe era, a lot of people, even nascent pro-life people, kind of looked askance at AUL, at Dennis, at the idea of the book, and, you guys are crazy. Come on. Look, I know that the Supreme Court's just given us Roe. It's this bad thing, but we're going to fix that. And the idea of euthanasia, in America, come on. Well within living memory of World War II, right? And the horrors there through things like the T4 program and other, anti-human policies that the Nazis pursued. How could it come to America? But Dennis and the authors of the book, Death, Dying, and Euthanasia, said, look, abortion is the adoption of a logic. And the logic isn't limited to the act of abortion, because the logic is that human persons are disposable. And that human persons, their lives, the good of their lives, is to be understood basically in an Enlightenment frame, a Lockean type frame, a privatized frame, where, free consent, free choice within a very narrow realm is all that matters. And if that could sanction the killing of a child in the womb by her father or her mother, of course it would sanction later the killing of that mother by another child, for instance. And so, the logic has been with us from the beginning. That's why Roe really was this touch point for the whole spectrum of issues, and why I said earlier I think the founders of AUL were prophetic, because they saw that this was connected. It wasn't one issue, it was a spectrum of issues from the first day. Where do we go? Canada is, our northern neighbor, our example in where things are going. We can look over to the EU, to certain countries like Belgium or the Netherlands to see other examples. But to look at the reasons for hope, we can say that because we're in a federalist system, there are going to be states that are better than others. I would think states like Florida, maybe Virginia now, will be better than others in the short to medium term. Longer term, we've got to correct the lingering challenge on this issue, which is, we thought at the time Washington v. Glucksberg, the Supreme Court case on euthanasia, on assisted suicide, basically, we thought it was a great victory, and it was in a certain sense. It wasn't like Roe. It didn't say that there was a constitutional right to kill yourself or to kill others. But the 9-0 decision simply sort of said, well, the Constitution doesn't say much about it. It's kind of silent on it. So the states can do whatever they want. And so since Washington v. Glucksberg, we've seen states move on this issue to embrace it. And so the pushback ultimately to ensure that we don't end up with a euthanasia regime, where we don't end up with, some Silicon Valley tech startup saying, we've created an autonomous van with the needle right in the van. It'll pick you up, it'll kill you, and it'll deliver you to the funeral home clean, and because you have no family, because our society has collapsed, we'll just bill you in advance. that kind of dystopia, right? Which, I laugh about right now, but it's a headline you can actually imagine, more or less, at TechCrunch, right? To avoid that, we've got to fight not just in the states, not just to say, well, we've lost Oregon, or we've lost Connecticut, or we've lost the District of Columbia, or whatever on these issues, but, we'll hold the line on Texas. We'll have one state. No, we've got to say also that we've got to fix this at the congressional level. We've got to fix it at the national level. So whether that looks like a revisitation of Glucksberg for a future Supreme Court to think, is the Constitution really silent on the idea of killing yourself? Or are there certain natural realities, natural laws, natural rights embedded that the Constitution can't bracket? Could be something to think about from a judicial perspective, or at least from a congressional perspective, an executive perspective. Are there things that Congress should do to ensure that people aren't abandoned? Because that's what it's about, ultimately. It's about abandonment. And the question is a simple one at the end of the day. It comes down to, do we owe one another suicide assistance, or do we owe one another suicide prevention, the prevention of self-harm? I think the answer is obvious, but a lot of people have been kind of led to think, it's murky, it's not clear. And so we've got to continue to show them. We've got to shine that spotlight.
Tom, well, we're out of time for today, but thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. If people are interested in following your work or the work of your organization, where can they find you?
Thanks so much, Johnny. AUL, because we're so early, we got one of those hot domain names, AUL.org. Nice 3 letters, just like ISI. And, our website has so much for you to engage on the law and policy front. You can look up Make Birth Free, our policy paper. You can look up the Lincoln proposal, our suggestion for a future pro-life president. You can also follow us on Facebook, of course, on X. x.com/AUL. And we have so much to say. We hope you join us in the work.
That's great. Thanks again, Tom.
Thanks so much.
And thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this episode, be sure to head over to our website at isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we'll see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.